Hey everyone, today I'm reading from Hal Draper's Socialism from Below. I'm reading the introduction by Ernest Haberkern. I have pieces on this channel by Ernest Haberkern that are about, basically about bureaucratic collectivist theory and third camp socialist theory. So I'm going to read his introduction here. The essays of Hal Draper collected here fall into three groups. The first section consists of a number of historical studies, most of them published in the socialist journal New Politics in the 1960s. New Politics being the prominent third camp socialist journal to this day, and it includes a lot of people that fall outside of this camp. It has more orthodox Trotskyist voices in it, but it also has, I think, like people like Murray Bookchin might have published in it at certain points, and certain people more sympathetic to anarchism as well. So it's pretty open, but its core, I would say, is third campist Trotskyism, or third camp socialism at the very least. All of them illustrate the thesis that he felt was central to understanding the current plight of the socialist movement. In Draper's view, the divisions running through the history of the socialist movement between reformists and revolutionaries, authoritarians and democrats, putschists and gradualists, the divisions and disputes which have provided the categories in terms of which the history of the movement has been written, were secondary. The important distinction was between those socialists who looked for some outside authority which would hand down salvation to the grateful masses from above, and those who saw the key to the reform of existing society in the struggle from below for self-emancipation. This conviction did not arise in a vacuum. It was not the result of quiet contemplation. Hal Draper joined the socialist movement in 1934. It was 1 year after the triumph of Nazism in Germany. In Russia, the purge trials were just getting underway. The next few years saw the massive revolt of the Spanish working class in defense of democracy and socialism, and the betrayal and defeat of that revolt. The decade ended with the signing of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. By the early 1940s, there are plenty of prophets. James Burnham is perhaps the best-known example, who insisted that hard-headed logic required everyone to accept the victory of the new totalitarian order, parenthesis, their term, and parenthesis, as scientifically predetermined, however distasteful that prospect might seem. Capitalism was doomed, but so was any democratic alternative to capitalism. Hopefully, this new order would move in a more liberal and humane direction in the course of its development, leaving behind the admittedly somewhat crude and harsh early models built by Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini. Socialism and democracy, however, were definitely dead. Whatever progressive tasks the working class movement might have claimed as its goal were being carried out by the dictators much more expeditiously. The 30s were, however, a time of popular rebellion as well as of defeat. The successes of fascism and Stalinism, which led some to despair, drove others to the left. In the United States, the elementary explosion of labor militancy that gave birth to the CIO was as much a part of the story as was the demagoguery of Huey Long or the pro-fascist sympathies of some liberals and leftists. Footnote: see the chapter in this collection titled Neo-Corporatist and Neo-Reformist, which is on this channel, by the way, for a discussion of such pro-Mussolini and pro-corporatist sympathies. Lincoln Steffens and George Bernard Shaw are just two rather notorious examples of the trend. I don't know who Lincoln Steffens is, but George Bernard Shaw was an important figure in British Fabianism, who was also a Stalinist sympathizer as well as a fascist sympathizer. It was this side of the 30s that had formed Hal Draper's socialism. As one of the leaders of the student strike against war in the mid-30s, Hal Draper saw firsthand a popular movement which began as an angry revolt against the system, turned into a pro-administration, completely respectable and pretty much dead organization. In this episode, which Draper describes in some detail in Chapter 8 of this collection, the Communist Party played a prominent role in alliance with liberals and the right wing of the socialists in taming the movement. At the time, this behavior was explained as a function of the American Communist Party's dependence on Russian foreign policy. But what explained that? Throughout the Second World War, and an even more disturbing pattern kept repeating itself. A liberal administration, or, at any rate, an administration supported by practically all liberals and leftists, carried out some of the most reactionary policies the country had seen in the name of, quote, fighting fascism. Japanese Americans were shipped off to concentration camps for the crime of having the wrong ancestry. Segregation of African Americans went unquestioned, even in the armed forces. Black men were expected to fight and die in the name of a freedom they did not enjoy. The gains won by a militant CIO were systematically dismantled, and a no-strike policy rigidly enforced throughout the union movement. Through it all, the Communist Party outdid the most rabid of traditional reactionaries in the Communist Party's denunciations of anyone who dared speak out against the militarization of American society. From the late 30s on, this behavior forced large sections of the socialist movement and its liberal periphery to re-examine old ideas. Was state ownership the defining characteristic of socialism? If so, was Stalinist Russia socialist? And if it was socialism, if that was socialism, who needed it? Quote, new class, end quote, theories of Russia proliferated. As the war against fascism gave way to the Cold War and Stalinism replaced Nazism as the boogeyman, whose defeat required the sacrifice of all the values and institutions that were supposedly being defended, this process of re-examination intensified. Hal Draper, first as a trade union organizer and shipyard worker active, along with his wife Anne, in the rank-and-file revolt against the no-strike pledge, and then as a socialist journalist and editor of the independent socialist paper, Labor Action, participated in this process of re-examination. Labor Action, in particular, was a major contributor to the discussion. Labor Action's articles and editorials had an influence on left socialist opinion both in America and in Europe. Draper's unique contribution was his emphasis on the global character of what was going on. It was not just in Russia that traditional socialist and democratic values and ideas were being transmuted into something else, even into their opposites. For many, James Burnham again being the prime example, this rethinking led to nothing more than a vulgar anti-communism. Politically, that meant support for the NATO alliance as the lesser evil and a deep pessimism about the possibility of human progress. Theoretically, it led to a shallow fatalism. For Hal Draper, this kind of Cold War theorizing represented a failure of intellectual as well as political nerve. The first section in this book is the 1968 pamphlet, The Two Souls of Socialism. It presents the thesis that it's the theme of the collection and sums up the political evolution described above. The Two Souls of Socialism's political impact on a generation of socialists in the United States and Great Britain has been considerable. The first section concludes with a debate between Draper and Max Nomad, which appeared in New Politics in response to the publication of The Two Souls. I know of no other contemporary discussion of the meaning and future of socialism which makes it as clear as this debate does that what is at issue is the possibility of democracy in any sense. The second section of this anthology contains articles dealing with the New Left in the 1960s. Hal Draper was one of the very few leftists of his generation who unreservedly endorsed and supported the radicalism of the new generation. His pamphlet, The Mind of Clark Kerr, which is included in this selection as Chapter 7, played a key role in clarifying the aims of the free speech movement for the movement itself. It is hard to see how anyone without Draper's politics could have understood just what was going on in the minds of what was going on in the mind of this liberal administrator. Despite his unqualified support for the New Left's radical rejection of American politics, which is what frightens so many ex-radicals, Draper was well aware of the difficulties faced by a predominantly student radical movement in a country where the working class and the people in general were still quite conservative. The article in this section, titled Free Speech and Political Struggle, was written as the New Left was beginning to collapse in the face of these difficulties. It, as well as the article In Defense of the New Radicals, was not intended merely to point with alarm to some of the problems of the New Radicals, but to understand the movement and its limitations in the belief that any movement for self-emancipation has to understand itself, including its own weaknesses, if it is to move forward. These articles appeared in the magazines New Politics and The Independent Socialist. The chapter titled Berkeley, The New Student Revolt is taken from a section of the paperback book on the Berkeley events published by Grove Press. Grove Press published a lot of books that other people wouldn't publish at this time. And I think they were the first. I don't know. They were the first to like. They were very important in getting like fighting back against freedom of speech in like film, and like so like movies that had nudity became legal. I think they were kind of like indirectly responsible for like the explosion of like pornography in like the 70s, because they were trying to get bans on nudity in like art films lifted. And then I think when that ban happened, what basically happened is that mostly just like porno theaters exploded. But I can't remember the hell it was called. You know the movie. There was like the Swedish movie. It was like something in yellow, something in blue, or something like that. But it was like a Swedish or Danish movie that had nudity in it. That they like fought a court battle and won over, and it kind of like changed the face of censorship in the United States. So it's kind of interesting. Anyway, the last section is a small sampling of Hal Draper's prolific writing in defense of the tradition of socialism from below. I have included in this section 3 previously unpublished essays which defend Marx's emphasis on the working class as the agent of social change. The first, on the feminism of the early 19th century working class socialist James Morrison, is a chapter from an unpublished manuscript on socialist feminism. The second is an edited transcript of a series of talks directed at an audience of New Left students, which attempted to disabuse them of their anti-union prejudices. The third is a re-examination of Lenin's writing on party organization. The last article in this section, and a fitting conclusion to the book, is an early version of what became several chapters in Draper's study of Marx's political theory and activity. It was published in Socialist Register and describes the evolution of Marx and Engels from typical, quote, new leftists, end quote, of the 1840s to the advocates of socialism from below. The End. E. Haberkern, November 2000.